Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Project podcast. Today I'm joined by King Crocoduck. I always enjoy our conversations. He's made fantastic series on his YouTube channel, such as The Science Wars and Nuking Social Constructionism. In this episode, we talk about the connection between science and philosophy. We talk about naturalism, Thomas Kuhn, sociology, and much more. I do my best to keep up with him, as I clearly am nowhere near as well versed in philosophy or science as he is. But hopefully the conversation is entertaining. The link to his YouTube channel is in the description of the video below. I also want to mention that I know how I look extremely pretentious with those books in the background. I honestly just put them there because I was cleaning my room and I didn't realize how bad it looked until I started editing the video. So apologies for that. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, so I'm here once more for the third time with King Crocoduck, or KC. Mr. KC, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I really appreciate you coming back on, because the sorts of conversations that we have had so far, they've pivoted around this issue of sort of the concerns that we have with where the academy is going in regards to how they approach knowledge and what they do with that knowledge. But what I liked about our conversations is that we tried to approach it academically rather than in an activist manner. So, for instance, in our first video, when we talked about wokeness, we talked about social constructionism. We talked about this deconstructionist attitude in the academy, and we talked about philosophers like Foucault and Karl Popper. So that's what I really like about these conversations. And what I want to make apparent for those people watching is that the aim of this video is not to be an a sort of anti-woke diatribe. That's not the purpose of this video, right? That the purpose of this video is just to analyze the philosophy of naturalism and sort of why King Crocoduck here ascribes to it. He made 3 great videos that I highly recommend. They're very dense and they're very long, so I recommend sort of 0.05 speed so you can understand it. But yeah. So I sort of want to start off by asking you what are the sort of intellectual interests that you have, and what are the sort of things that you talk about your YouTube channel, and basically who is King Crocoduck?
So by trade, I'm a biomedical physicist. So I've talked about physics on my YouTube channel, and moving forward, I might be integrating a little bit of biology and medicine into that. I like debunking pseudoscience and teaching about science, and I'm especially interested in the philosophy of science and the way in which the abuse of the philosophy of science by certain trends in the academic world are enabling academic currents that I don't think are interested in the production of knowledge. I don't think they're interested in tracking truth. I think they're interested in using the academy as an instrument to achieve an ideological agenda, even if that comes at the expense of truth. And I find that unacceptable. So I speak out against that.
Mm-hmm. That's great that you mentioned that now, because I do want to put a pin in that when we ultimately describe or try to understand, I think is a better term for it, the methodology of the social sciences. And I am particularly excited to talk about it, especially because I think I've mentioned this maybe twice on my YouTube channel, but on top of my main major, another major that I'm doing is religious studies. And so religious studies, the methodology employed, and I think I'm very, very confident in saying this, it's overwhelmingly anti-naturalist. So once we go down that route, I'm excited to have that conversation. So you mentioned that you have an interest in the philosophy of science, and I'm assuming it's safe to say that you're a scientist first and a philosopher second, or do you think in the same way that you describe in your videos that the two are just basically mutually reinforcing?
Yeah, the two are continuous. I think critical introspection is not exclusive to philosophers. Scientists engage in it all the time, and empirical activities aren't exclusive to professional scientists. Philosophers who are interested in something about the world as it actually is. Philosophers who are interested in tracking truth rather than just building beautiful structures in their heads. They'll take an interest in this as well.
Mm-hmm. So, how would you define? This is going to sound like a very crude and open-ended question, but I think it's necessary, especially based on how these conversations are being had among people on YouTube. I mean, there was a whole debate that you had with this guy named Jangles about this. How would you define science, and then how would you define philosophy?
Yeah, these are not easy questions. You know, when it comes to the definition of science, really, it was my failure to arrive at a satisfactory definition, my failure to carve out science from other kinds of activities that ultimately led me to the development of the concepts discussed in nuking social constructionism. I define science purely in methodological terms. I understand the scientific activity to be the development of models that satisfy a very specific set of criteria. If you're developing or testing these models, then you are engaging in science, at least to some degree. And if you're engaging in the development and testing of the best of these models, which are going to be the models that satisfy those criteria to the greatest extent relative to all competing models, then you're probably a professional scientist by trade.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think the general conception of philosophy, if you read Godfrey Smith or if you read really any philosophical textbook, the way that they sort of condense it for the sake of their students is that philosophy is the articulation of empirical theories, where we have science and then you can make many observations using the scientific method and come to certain conclusions. But the only way that you could properly interpret that is through philosophy, and there's many reasons for this. It's not just a matter of sort of adopting sort of you see the evidence or you see the theory and you just immediately assume it's true. There has to be some understanding, or the way you describe it is there has to be some things that you hold epistemologically true beforehand and some things that you hold ontologically true beforehand.
Well, maybe not necessarily beforehand. Certainly in conjunction with the appraisal of evidence, right? Because I think what you're gesturing towards is that science and philosophy, the kind of mutual role that they play is in the testing and acquisition of evidence, but also the interpretation of that evidence and the process of theory making. When we create our representations of the world, there are inferential relations between our observations that characterize what kinds of representations we hold in our heads. And philosophy, done right, can play an extremely useful role in that regard. Given a set of information, given a set of experiences, you have a zillion different ways to potentially interpret them. There are a zillion different ways to organize those experiences and arrive at mutually contradictory pictures of the world. And this is called the problem of underdetermination. And philosophy can go a long way towards helping you distinguish between them and helping you pick which one is best. But the catch is that philosophy does have to fundamentally be informed by your development of these models, by your scientific activity.
Yeah, I think now we could probably sort of describe what the social constructionist view of philosophy is and its relation to science. And I think this probably goes beforehand. I could be wrong, right now, the main people who philosophers sort of point towards to try to have a conversation about the role of philosophy and the role of science, right now, I think it's safe to say the name that I've heard the most, at least in religious studies, is Michel Foucault. And then beforehand, it probably was mostly ascribed to someone like Kuhn when there was the whole debate between Kuhn and Popper. What would you say is a Steelman view of what the social constructionists, at least the ones that you've had conversations with that are pretty popular, what would they say is the proper role of philosophy and science?
Well, generally, they tend to agree that philosophy comes prior to science, and this is the classical view. This is the view that you'll get in an introductory philosophical textbook. You'll get a story to the effect of there were the pre-Socratics, there was Thales and Heraclitus and Parmenides. I'm butchering their names, but it doesn't matter. I know who I'm talking about. You know who I'm talking about. And then eventually, you'll have Francis Bacon come along, and there's the birth of modern science. We can trace it to this discrete point in time at the beginning of the Enlightenment, and there's science. There it exists because philosophers brought it into the world. This isn't the social constructionist view qua social constructionism. This is the social constructionist view qua classical theories of philosophy. So in going against this picture, I'm actually being a little bit more radical than the social constructionists. This is the character of naturalism. Naturalism disavows this story. Naturalism says that this story is just like what philosophers like to tell themselves, that in reality, the activities that we ascribe to science are activities that have been taking place regardless of what philosophers had to say. You don't need to develop a philosophical system to start engaging in the rudimentary activities that characterize scientific practice. But you do need philosophy to come along and elevate science into something more than it would be without it.
And so you're pretty much a big naturalist. I think that's safe to say. And again, I always recommend watching your social construction, your nuking social constructionism videos. I think even Benjamin Boyce sort of lauded you for it. He really appreciated those videos. And so naturalism takes many different varieties as far as I'm concerned. You have people like Dennett, Graham-Oppie, Price, Stroud. There's a lot of different sort of naturalists in this field. Are there some particular strains of naturalism that you don't think quite they didn't get it quite right? Not necessarily that for a fact which version of naturalism is correct, but rather that you can identify other versions that sort of make you raise your eyebrows?
I think people who presuppose ontological naturalism are being naive, and they're opening themselves up to all kinds of attack. I think that when you presuppose that everything that exists is natural, you open yourself up to criticisms that you're arbitrarily excluding possible explanations that might not necessarily fit that mold. And this was the approach of people like Stephen Jay Gould with his non-overlapping magisteria. You presuppose a natural state of affairs for science, and then for religion, you can presuppose whatever you like. And this kind of approach imagines that there is a distinct kind of activity, a kind of introspective and analytic activity that is not available for a scientific inquiry. So when scientists start getting involved in places that people don't like, morality, ethics, the consciousness, society, sociology, and by sociology, I mean reducing that in biological terms. You know, there are sacred cows that you're going after once you do that, and a lot of people get angry at that. So there's this ontological approach where for sciences and for the natural sciences or the physical and life sciences, you know, you have one kind of domain. This is the domain in which the quote unquote natural things live. You know, they have simple trajectories, and the way I hear social scientists describe it, it's easier than understanding society. We could talk about that. And then there's this other realm where the techniques of literary criticism and interpretation and lived experience are valid modes of appraising knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I have problems with that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm excited to get into them. So I think from here, a good way to go towards is discussing what it is, what is the criteria that we can employ to understand what is closer to reality and what is farther away from it. As you mentioned in one of your videos, the scientific method, it doesn't function the same for every academic discipline. It's different. For trying to understand the accuracy of history is going to be different from trying to understand the accuracy of any of the hard sciences. And so, and this is why sociology is really, really difficult in a way. You know, I think Paul Bloom's psychology, he says it's in this exact manner that psychology is a lot harder than physics, because it's just so much harder to find a way of knowing whether or not what you are studying is actually valuable, it's worthwhile, if it's not, you know, BS. And so you identify 4 operational criteria that if a claim is sort of in accordance with a lot of these, then you have good reason to be hopeful. So what would you mind running down sort of your big 4 operational criteria?
Sure. So the first criteria is predictive accuracy and precision, which is fairly self-explanatory. The second one is explanatory efficiency, and this one is subdivided into 2 components called parsimony and consilience. Parsimony basically meaning that you only apply you don't multiply entities beyond necessity, basically. You apply Occam's razor. You only make use of the posits that are absolutely necessary to your theory, without sacrificing the prediction part. And if you smuggle in anything else, in addition to that, something that's not essential to the theory, something that doesn't add to the predictive power, then your theory is less efficient, and that's less desirable. Mm-hmm. So that's the parsimony part. The consilience part essentially entails consistency with the remainder of your body of knowledge. And if there turns out to be a contradiction, then the burden of proof will have to lie with this theory, this novel theory that's positing something different from the rest of your body of knowledge, to show that it's the rest of your body of knowledge that's wrong and that needs revising. Mm-hmm. The third one is optimal flexibility, and this is a compromise between 2 extreme and undesirable properties of theories. You don't want a theory that's too rigid, a theory that is to say that won't revise itself when counterfactual evidence is provided. But at the same time, you don't want a theory that's too flexible, which is a theory that when such evidence is provided, when unambiguously falsifying evidence is provided, the theory just changes interpretation and says, oh, I actually predicted that all along. You want to meet somewhere in the middle of that, a theory that is able to change in the face of counterfactuals, but is not so flexible as to be non-falsifiable. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is rational coherence, and that just means internal consistency. You want to maximize the extent to which your body of knowledge is internally consistent, you want to minimize contradictions and tensions.
Yeah, I like these. And I think a very important one there that I think a lot of people have a blind spot for is the optimal flexibility one.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think we're especially going to talk that towards the end when we talk about the social sciences. But the idea is that everyone ultimately uses this same method, even the layman, when they go about their normal day-to-day lives and they interact with the external world. In their head, they create models about what to do. These models sort of inform when they should cross the street as they look to make sure that there's no incoming car. Everyone ultimately operates on this model. A scientist is probably just much better at using this model effectively because they're trained in it. And so this kind of gives me hope for humanity in a way, if it's true, because it shows that we have the toolkit necessary to converge on our. There's going to be disagreement, but the toolkit necessary, the beginning axioms are there ultimately to come to conclusions that won't wipe out our species. I guess for a lack of a better term.
The toolkit
Um,
is there. The
mhm,
toolkit is there, but it's not all that we have. There's a reason why Kent Hovind exists. There's a reason why Robin DiAngelo exists, because in addition to these cognitive capabilities, we've also evolved social capabilities. And I'm treating these as though they were distinct. They're really not. But there's a subset of cognitive capabilities that are non-social, and those I think are what found those are at the foundation of science.
mhm.
But for the social stuff, the trouble is we're apes, and you know it's good to be optimistic, I guess, that we have a good toolkit, but we also carry a lot of baggage, and it can be draining on one's optimism to see
Mhm,
the fallout from that baggage.
mhm. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's really hard to be optimistic in religious studies classes. It's the hardest thing ever. But what makes me more optimistic, I should say, rather than just generally optimistic, is the fact that the toolkit is there, and in the same way that someone can be argued out of their dogmatic beliefs, whether that means Daryl Davis convincing, you know, tens of clans members out of their convictions, and Megan Murphy being convinced out of the Westboro Baptist Church. That possibility is there, and even a pessimistic would say it's a tiny possibility. Who cares? I mean, but that's all we have, and that's all we can hope for at this point. So we might as well keep trying. And again, we'll go deeper into that once we start discussing the social sciences and where we think they went wrong. And so right now we're at the point where what we've claimed so far is that uh, everyone ultimately operates on this big four operational criteria, and we construct models in our heads that are that the effectiveness of the model is really contingent on how well we're applying that big four operational criteria. And then we get into sort of the spectrum of it, and then the question then ultimately becomes, is this a product of evolution? Well, the answer obviously is that, yeah, it is a byproduct of evolution, right?
Yeah.
But what is the difference between the big four operational criteria that we understand, that we can think about, and that we can make better models on? So if you make a model, right, it sort of intuitively like God exists, but then you think about the big four operational criteria, and because you can think about it and because you can understand why it's effective, you recalibrate your model. Now, how is this different uh, from other animals in the animal kingdom, where you argue that they also operate on the big four criteria, but I mean, there's clearly a disconnect between us and them, right? So is it that evolution sort of just instills a very, very general sense of this criteria,
Well, is
but
that so clear though?
That
I
other
mean,
animals can operate on the Big Four criteria.
no, that there's this huge disconnect.
Oh,
Um, I mean, as I see it, the difference is a matter of degree and not of kind. Um, they're developing their own Big Four compliant models, but the degree to which their cognitive capabilities allow them to do that is less than ours. Um, I think fundamentally, it just comes down to the cognitive capabilities.
mhm,
Um, it's not so much that there's a novel cognitive function that human beings have that that allows them to create something different about the big four. I mean, yeah, there are new cognitive capabilities that allow us to improve our big four operation or our big four compliant models, but it's not like we've added an additional criterion that the animals don't adhere to.
mhm. Right. What I was getting at, I think, is that, and I'm sure I'm going to anger a lot of people as soon as I say this, is this idea that the big difference between humans and other animals in the animal kingdom, as far as the most up to date psychology and neuroscience, that there's that component of being self-aware to the extent that we can recognize and understand these models and reevaluate our previous positions and beliefs because of, for a lack of a better term, consciousness, or the ability that we can recognize and understand difficult concepts in a way that other animals can't. And what I was ultimately going to get at later in the podcast, once we sort of start talking about the social sciences, is that, or in particular, against arguments that evolution did at all give us any reliable way of understanding reality, is that what I often wonder, and what I think might be true, is that that's the toolkit, the big four criteria. But the big difference between animals and us is that we also have the toolkit, and it's as you said, it's on a spectrum. We're further on that spectrum, and the special thing about this toolkit is that once a species, an animal, becomes conscious and self-aware, it's able to use that toolkit to recalibrate their models, which is like a huge difference, I think, between other animals in the animal kingdom. I hope that made sense. I know I can sometimes not make sense, but that's more so of what I was trying to get at. Mm,
Um, Yeah, and our capacity to, I guess, for lack of a better term, consciously reevaluate our models definitely definitely is an advantage in terms of revising the models and improving them. Um, so yeah, that's
mhm.
something I can definitely agree with.
Right. And I think this is I think this would be my argument against the people, and this is, this isn't sort of what they say right now in classes, but back when Kuhn was a lot more popular than he is now, the argument that sort of Kuhn would say is that science operates in paradigms, and that there is no actual, what he would specifically say is that the sort of quantum mechanics paradigm of physics is not scientifically superior in a real literal sense than the classical mechanics one. And because he says that, he said that there's this thing of incommensurability where you cannot talk across paradigms in a way that both people would be able to understand each other. Now, I think this is obviously wrong, and I don't understand how he, like, I literally don't understand how he thinks that someone who is at quantum mechanics can't talk to someone who still believes in Newtonian mechanics, and they won't understand each other. So I could be misunderstanding what he's saying here, but the idea that we can recalibrate our models based on this big four criteria, I think, is a huge blow to Kuhn. I don't know if I don't know if you think that's the case, or if what is your main issue with the sort of Kuhnian philosophy that used to be much more popular?
Well, I mean, I have a somewhat different perspective on Kuhn.
Mhm,
I think the view that you articulated is kind of an extreme reading of Kuhn that would have been promoted by people like Paul Feyerabend, who I regard as the real kinds of villains in this story. I think Kuhn's intentions, especially later in life when people started abusing his ideas to a greater degree, was that incommensurability prevents. Yeah, you're right. He didn't get that quite right. I don't think he went quite so far as to take the view that there's no such thing as scientific progress. Um, that's more Feyerabend style.
He
I think
said there's progress in normal science, right? Is what he called it.
yeah, there's progress there,
Mhm.
and I don't think he took quite as relativistic a view as is often attributed to him.
Mhm.
But I do think he did get something very wrong about incommensurability, and that's that incommensurability is in reality unidirectional. You cannot go from the old paradigm to the new paradigm, but you are able to go from the new paradigm to the old paradigm because the new paradigm is a generalization of the old paradigm. So you can go from quantum mechanics to classical physics. You can't go from classical physics to quantum mechanics, right? You can derive a mathematically equivalent formula for Newton's second law, beginning with the Schrodinger equation, but you can't go from Newton's second law to the Schrodinger equation.
Hmm.
And the reason for this is because quantum mechanics is a generalization of classical physics. Classical physics just lives in a certain regime of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is the normal physics of the universe, and classical physics is what you get when you aggregate a whole bunch of quantum systems. It's a similar situation with general relativity. Classical physics there is just a special case. Um, it's the special case of general relativity, F equals ma, when the region of space-time that you're dealing with and the types of masses that you're dealing with are so small that they're not appreciably distorting space-time. So, as with the quantum mechanics example, you can go from Einstein's field equations to Newton's law of gravitation, but you can't go from Newton's law of gravitation to Einstein's field equations. And again, that's because Newton's laws are a special case of general relativity, and they're also a special case of quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so now moving back onto the I'm getting scared that we're going to get too close to the social stuff before we fully establish naturalism. So then moving on to the big four criteria, do you think that is your argument contingent on the claim that evolution did give us the toolkit to understand reality properly? Because someone could argue that it wasn't that evolution gave us it didn't incentivize us to understand reality, but rather it incentivized to understand the laws of evolution on Earth, which is a separate thing from what reality actually is.
Yeah, I'm a pragmatist, so I'm not particularly concerned with capital R reality or capital T truth.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I'm concerned, I have streets to cross and bills to pay and uh, dog mouths to feed. For all practical purposes, I need to create models that satisfy the big four criteria in order to achieve these tasks. And it doesn't really matter to me whether I'm plugged into the matrix or whether reality is just a dream or whatever. That doesn't affect my life one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember you mentioning. I think what you basically don't really care about external world skepticism. You're more focused on, look, like we're all affected in a similar way, in an identical way, and naturalism is the best way to understand how it is that we're affected and what we can do about it.
Yeah, I think external world skepticism and this Cartesian demon scenario where what if everything is just an illusion that's brought to us by an evil demon who's deceiving us. I think this is misformulated in the minds of many people. I think that the kind of view being implied here is that if you don't give a satisfactory account of how the things that you perceive are real, then you have to default to this demon story or this kind of skepticism. But that's not actually the case. What's actually the case is that you have competing models for how reality is functioning, and one of those models involves this magical demon, and the other one involves reality as it presents itself to my senses. And um, you know when I have to choose between these models, I can choose the more efficient one, the one that doesn't make this extra demon posit as an explanation for the world that I live in. So for all practical purposes, even if it's true that um, the demon is controlling my perceptions, um, it doesn't matter that I'm wrong.
Mm. Okay. In this case, I don't know how familiar you are with a philosopher called Donald Hoffman, I think his name is. Are you aware of who he is?
I know the name.
Hmm. Yeah, so he became popular because he came up with this idea. He wrote a book called The Case Against Reality, and in it he basically argues, and I hope I'm not butchering his argument because I haven't read the book. I've really only just sort of listened to him on podcasts, and so I'm not going to make an argument against him because of that, because I just don't feel comfortable. But I do know that the general thesis of his argument is that evolution didn't grant us sort of the toolkit to understand reality as it actually is. What it did was that it granted us the toolkit to understand reality as an interface. So in the same way that you can look at a computer screen and you see the icons of the computer screen, and those icons are representations of
You don't
ultimately
see
what
the
you.
transistors. Yeah, yeah,
Right, exactly. Yeah, you don't see the electrons, stuff like that. So in this way, naturalism would be kind of compatible with what Donald Hoffman is saying here, on a surface level reading.
yeah. If the title of his book is "The Case Against Reality," I wonder what inferences he draws from this. But as you've described it so far, yeah, I'm on board with that.
Hmm.
You know, um,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I like, so for instance, just for the sake of giving some evidence to his claim, is that he created a sort of simulation with his students where they gave two groups of simulated organisms a complete set of rules of how the game is actually played, and then he gave the other set of organisms different sets of rules, and he sort of turned the dial on the way in which they interpret the rules. And what he found out that based on the total fitness utility that one organism gets versus the other, the one who understood reality as it actually was not better off than the one who sort of only understood it in a way that benefited itself. And again, he could probably come on here and just slap me because I'm totally just butchering everything that he's saying, but I think that's a good introduction for someone who wants to sort of understand it, and then listen to him and say, "Oh, Vincent doesn't really understand what he's talking about." But okay.
Well, as you presented it, I completely agree.
Hmm. Yeah, it's super interesting. The only time, and by the way, I completely agree with you in regards to external world skepticism. Uh, like that's all they talk about in philosophy classes, which I think is fine. I think there's good mental exercises. I don't really care though, because as you said, it doesn't affect me. Maybe I'll think about it, but I wouldn't waste too much time thinking about it when there are other things to think about that are going to actually affect the world in a substantial way.
Yeah, I think it's just rhetoric. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think that it's a way for people um, who want to have certain a priori views of the world that allows them to make transcendental types of arguments and start sneaking in spooky magical things. I think it's a way for them to invalidate people or people's ideas, the philosophies of people who don't take that kind of um, rationalistic approach.
Mhm.
It's the evil demon is fundamentally an anti-empirical piece of rhetoric that basically says if you can't give a logically airtight account of where knowledge comes from, then you're going to have to default to this other thing. And again, that's just a mischaracterization of the actual situation, which is we have a whole set of competing models, including the evil demon model, and we have to assess their value in terms of some set of criteria. And it just so happens that the criteria that I value and that you value and that everybody else values, whether they acknowledge it or not, are going to be the ones. These are going to be the values that govern the dismissal of the demon model.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's what I mean. He posited the demon. the issue with the demon model that I had was obviously everything that you're saying, right? And obviously, I don't care that my values don't. There's no connection between my values and the demon model necessarily, but that was really an attempt to try to justify the existence of God in a way that we know clearly and distinctly that he must exist, and he starts off from there. And I think this is why I'm so disillusioned with rationalism, because, and I'd like to ask you this as well, because some naturalists are empiricists, others aren't, but I think my issue with rationalism has always been that you earlier in the podcast you said it's just rhetoric. I think that's a lot of what rationalism is. And so when I read Craig and Moreland and a lot of these justifications for the existence of God, I don't see anything more than the twisting of words in a way that comport for a particular conclusion. In other words, it's a possibly deductively valid argument, but it's not sound at all. And it's obvious that it's not sound. I don't know what your thoughts are on between the debate of rationalism and empiricism.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I'm an empiricist. I'm on the same page. Yeah.
Yeah, it is aggravating, because whenever I talk to a religious person, mostly on Discord, because I'm in the AR sort of Discord, and a lot of religious people come in and debate. 9 times out of 10, it's Thomas Aquinas that they use, and the other time is just very basic rationalistic arguments. And my argument is always like, you have to convince me of rationalism first before you sort of convince me of empiricism. Sorry, you have to convince me of rationalism before you, because I'm an empiricist. So that's always been my issue with religious arguments, and these sort of social arguments also that we're going to start discussing.
Very similar in character.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not even just in the way that they sort of come to their conclusions, but also in the language that they use. We discussed this earlier, right? A lot of the language that they use is very, very religious sounding. And so that's why I have sympathy for the sort of John McWhorter view that a lot of what we're seeing is, it literally is a new religion, where naive anthropologists will see and say, okay, I think I can classify this as a religion. So we discussed the Big Four criteria. We discussed how effective it is, and we discussed its possible evolutionary origin, and how it doesn't matter whether or not it actually maps onto a big R reality. It really doesn't matter. So we have and again, like, when you hear someone sort of argue against science as a way for understanding how reality works, I think already there might be some disagreement with what we're talking about as well, because they're under the impression that there's these people, and there are these people for sure, that science 100% tells us, what reality is and how it actually is. Brian Greene might be on board with this sort of thing, but there's maybe someone like Sean Carroll probably isn't, because Sean Carroll is also, he's very philosophical, so he probably wouldn't argue that science doesn't tell us how it actually is. It's more of a approximation, a better approximation than the alternatives. And so what's wrong with the argument that is often posited in social constructivist circles now? So now I'm interested in getting into the sociology of things. And you mentioned earlier that another thing that evolution gave us was incentives. It gave us sort of reasons that will benefit us regardless of what happens to anybody else, or what happens to the general institution of knowledge acquisition. So would you mind sort of expanding on that a bit?
Yeah, so the sociology of scientific knowledge has what we might call a weak program and a strong program. And the weak program says fairly milquetoast things, and in certain instances important things, about how social incentives can creep into science and cause abuse, and cause us to have worse science being defined in operational terms, in terms of how it performs and how it functions. But there's another kind of sociologist of science who is interested in dethroning the process itself as the crowning achievement of human thought. And this is achieved by arguing that the products of science are fundamentally social, that there are at bottom social incentives that drive the contents of scientific models, and that this is fundamentally an intractable problem. So if you were to ask someone from the Strong program, why is it that a scientist believes X? Their answer is not going to be cast in terms of the evidence or inferential relations associated with X that led the scientist to reach that conclusion. As far as they're concerned, that's like, the scientist's own explanation for why they believe X is like the ancient Greeks' belief for why they believe in Zeus. Because I've witnessed lightning in the sky, and I know that it was Zeus. There's proof of Zeus right there, right? That's just them articulating, articulating what they think is an objective observation, but is in fact just a socially situated observation, one that's contaminated by their place and time in history. So their explanation, the Strong program's explanation for why a scientist believes X, is because of the set of social relations that are applied to the scientist. This is the causal explanation. The scientist believes X because the scientist is situated within a set of social circumstances that led the scientist to conclude X.
Mm-hmm.
And in this way, knowledge becomes disconnected from evidence and inference, and instead becomes entirely connected to identity.
Yeah, and in my mind, at least, they have it backwards. Their explanation of why it is that we've constructed these this sort of criteria, because it benefits. I mean, there must have been, as you said, it's not just humans that follow this particular criteria. It's other animals in the animal kingdom. And the great thing that I like about the your four principles, but I think in generally speaking of the scientific enterprise and the way that it explains things, is that it can explain phenomena that is used to come as an argument against naturalism. So some people use the existence of religion as an argument against the very fact that religion exists and it has completely different epistemological priors is an issue. I don't think that's an issue. I think I would say, like, the reason why they are religious in the first place is sort of because they interpret reality maybe differently. But either way, you can explain religion using the Big Four criteria. You can explain it as an evolutionary advantage. And again, that's not even something that's unique to human. There's experiments that show that other animals in the animal kingdom, insects, exhibit superstitious tendencies. You can explain it, and we don't know with 100% certainty that this is the case, but there are some models out there, some evolutionary models, that show that if you are much more superstitious in the animal kingdom, you hear a rustling behind you, and it's either a lion or it's just wind. The people who developed that superstitious tendency to immediately assume it's something nefarious, that it's going to hurt you, it increased the likelihood that you were going to survive. Now, that doesn't mean it's therefore true, but it gives us a better reason to believe that scenario than the other. And that's why I'm a fan of naturalism. It gives us a way of explaining these other things that religion can't explain, the existence of atheists or science in a coherent way, or at least in a way that I think is coherent. But science and naturalism can. And so, the reason I'm bringing this up is because science can, as much as the social constructionists and the people who talk about how everything is operated on the basis of language, on the basis of discourse, on the basis of who has power, you can explain that using science. You can explain that using evolution with the least amount of posits. The amount of posits that the constructionist gives, it's really impressive. And someone described, I forget who described it this way, but from the outside, from someone who isn't on Twitter all the time, they'll see what the constructionist is saying, and it comes off as a conspiracy theory because there's just so many things that you have to accept in order to come to the conclusion that all these institutions came because white European men wanted power. And I want to make it perfectly clear, I am not saying this as a sort of anti-woke activist. I'm saying this in as much of an academic sense as I can possibly say it. It makes the claim that white European men constructed the concept of rationality and truth as a way to give them power. And I'm saying this example specifically because this is exactly what I was told in one of my religious studies classes. So I don't know if I'm sorry, I talked for way too long there. I apologize.
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good characterization of the situation.
Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on your argument is that there are political incentives for a lot of these social to sort of talk about this sort of thing where
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, as you mentioned, social science is in some sense harder than physics. That's not to say that people who engage in social science are engaging in more rigorous activity than physicists, because they're not. It's that their topic of study is one that is so multidimensional and so polycausal and so, I hate to use such a trite word, complex, that generating models, generating representations of the social world are seldom going to result in the kinds of models that will allow for actionable, large-scale change of the kind that would cohere with certain types of ideologies. The best social theories are the ones that are developed basically at the highest level of resolution, which means at the lowest level of organization, which is to say psychology. Psychology comes out with the best models, or at least certain subfields within psychology. And this is not necessarily an ideal situation in an intellectual environment where the quality of your models is judged by their ability to satisfy certain criteria. If you want a large-scale sociological change, you need to make some way of having it acceptable for sociological models to not adhere to the same standards as the rest of science. And this is something that the Strong program accommodates by treating scientific standards as though they're an exercise in gatekeeping, as though they're an exercise in maintaining the status quo by excluding other ways of knowing. They legitimize approaches to macro-level sociological phenomena that is rife with all kinds of flexibility issues, that doesn't actually have predictive accuracy and precision, deeply inefficient models, and often self-contradictory. It basically paves the way for critical theory to posture as scientific, even though it's fundamentally anti-scientific in character.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't to say that all of sociology employs critical theory, just that the worst of sociology employs critical theory.
Yeah. A noticeable amount of sociology at this point employs
I'm afraid
critical
so.
theory. Yeah. I've said this, I don't know if I tweeted this out, I have a goldfish memory, but the philosopher, without a doubt, and it's not even close, who's quoted the most in my religious studies classes was Foucault. And the class that I was referring to, where we were specifically told that rationality and the idea of truth with a capital T, it was more of a tool used to subjugate the oppressed. I remember asking the professor in that class, Are you claiming that we have this understanding of rationality, this idea that certain claims can make more sense and are in much better accordance with what we perceive in reality than others? Are you saying that white people, um, that they invented that idea, the very concept of it, or are you saying that white people having that concept or claiming that that concept is good is a product of white empiricism? And I've noticed the same exact thing in every single one of my classes, is that you will never get an actual response to the question that you posed. And so I forget what he responded with, but I remember I wrote it down. I should have picked it up. But his response had nothing to do with my question. I asked him Oh, I think I remember now. I asked him specifically, is the idea of rationality itself, are you saying that white people made the idea that normatively speaking, it is better than less rationality, or are you saying that only white people have it, or that they created the whole thing entirely? And then his response, I want to make sure I get his response. I remember his response as accurately as possible. His response was just that they used it and that they claimed other people were irrational in order to make them more morally superior. It's kind of similar to veganism, or meat eating, where some people will argue that the reason why it's justifiable for us to eat meat is because we're smarter or we have better attributes than the animal itself. I think that's what his response was, but he didn't answer my question though. That wasn't my question. I'm not disputing that they actually did consider other races and
Yeah.
ethnicities sort of
Yeah,
inferior.
it's a different. The difference is between whether rationality was applied as a tool of abuse, or whether rationality is inherently abusive.
Exactly, yeah. Um, and I never they won't give you a response, uh, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, there's a much more serious problem at the heart of this kind of rhetoric, which is the problem of reflexivity. People who tell you that standards of reason and standards of evidence are pretenses of the ruling class used to shut out oppressed people. Well, they're telling you a story, and they're holding a belief that allows them to tell this story, and it has to be asked, by what means other than evidence and rational inference did they arrive at those beliefs?
Mhm.
Right? What evidence can they provide for their view that evidence is oppressive, or what rational argument could they provide that rationality is inherently oppressive? I mean, it's a self-referential issue.
Mhm. Yeah, and oh, I mentioned this to Eric Hoffman, where just as you said, and what you alluded to, is that a lot of the problems are that people are putting their ethics before actual knowledge. And when you do that, when you put your personal moral beliefs first, we have reason to be suspicious of what it is that you claim is true and is not true, especially if there's, as you said, a political incentive there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the values which underlie the scientific activity have to be universal. And I claim that they're the values that inform the Big Four, and that they're possessed by all human beings, and indeed to some degree by all living systems. Um, I think that efforts to put specific socially situated values as necessarily informing good scientific practice, I think there's a real danger there for Lysenkoism.
hmm Oh, yeah, I think you mentioned that, and I think it was your second video on nuking social constructionism. Um, so going back to what I originally said about sort of me being optimistic because we all have the toolkit of the Big Four criteria. So I'm sure there are some people who don't actually believe what they're saying, but they're saying it for political reasons, for moral reasons. But I do think that most people who ascribe to this philosophy, um, even especially the students, I do think they're convinced of it. But that's because I mean, that's the only thing that they're really.
They don't know better.
Yeah.
They don't, the people who they're trusting to give them tools to be able to evaluate and appraise ideas are betraying them,
Hmm. Yeah,
and it's awful.
it is awful. Um, so what I was thinking was that we have the toolkit, and we still ultimately, if they genuinely believe what they're saying, we should ultimately have the capacity to be able to change their minds if we have sufficiently strong people who understand not even just necessarily naturalism, but just other oppositional viewpoints in the classroom. But the problem is that one philosophy has dominated the classroom, and it's not a philosophy that is shared by most philosophers. Um, it's a philosophy that is shared by sociologists, and that's where it matters the most in some sense.
Mhm.
Um, what concerns me is that now you're also seeing the natural sciences come to this, which was inconceivable maybe 20 years ago. But what do we do about this whole thing? Because and again, I'm not trying to argue from an activist standpoint. I'm
Mhm.
trying to argue from this ideology, or sorry, this philosophy. This philosophy specifically acts on the basis of activism. So a lot of these people will sort of they're okay with making sure that they don't hire, let's say, people who are naturalists. They're okay with not hiring people who don't subscribe to sort of postmodernism because their philosophy is inspired by activism.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Where my mind is at right now is, you know, I think the university might be unsavable at this stage, and I think that it should just be allowed to disintegrate. Um, I think, I've moved away from the academy and into the private sector, and you don't have this kind of bullshit in, the type of science that's done in the private sector.
Mhm.
We have a job to do. We have tasks we need to perform. We have results we need to obtain. We don't have time for this bullshit. And I think ultimately the disintegration of the university as a credentialing authority is going to be kind of the only path forward at this stage. This is my point of view.
Mhm. Credentialing authority, making connections for future job prospects. Uh, I mean that it really is a shame. I've mentioned this before. If I were I'm nowhere near smart enough to be able to write a book or anything like that, so this is never going to happen. But if I were smart enough to write a book, I would write it. I think my first one would be about what's going on in the university, where I can't reliably say that someone who went to college is going to know more than someone who watches YouTube videos. Now that might seem super controversial,
No, I
and
agree.
yeah, like people are gonna be like, "Well, you saying like anti-vaxxers know more than college?" That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, and I wish I told this to the professor that I just mentioned earlier, where my issue isn't necessarily that everyone has pretty much the same opinion. I definitely I have an issue with it, but that's not necessarily the main one that I would be arguing against him with. My main thing is that the point of the university is one to teach students about whatever discipline they're focusing on, and maybe you could also make an argument it's also for them to try to find jobs, sure, whatever. But a big part of the university system is to prepare them for life. And if you're only teaching them one thing, a thing that is very controversial in the real world, a thing that there are hundreds of millions of people in the United States that disagree with you, they're going to go out into the real world, never even, it's not just that they're not being taught properly the opposition's viewpoints, is that they don't even know them. They're going to get their asses kicked in real life. That's an embarrassment.
Well, to some degree, it depends on the extent to which these people are able to capture the institutions. Um, for something like private sector science, I think the incentives are organized in such a manner that that's probably not going to end up happening, where we're probably not going to have the kind of metastasis that we see in the academy. But, for a regular corporate job, I can definitely see I'm writing a little dystopian short story about this, actually. Uh, it's called The Kindness Industry, and it's about this office worker, and you don't know what his job is. Like, he does woke stuff all the time that that has nothing to do with the job that he actually, got hired for. It's just completely infiltrated, and it's everywhere, and he can't get away from it. Um, you know, this kind of job is a lot more common than my type of job, which I was very fortunate to get, which I'm very thankful for. Um, I think you're gonna have a small number of people who are in highly technical workplaces that don't enculturate this type of intellectual environment. And then you're gonna, I'm probably putting my foot in my mouth, but Google, for example, is not one such environment. It's definitely an environment that's been metastasized by this nonsense. Um, but you're gonna have basically the managerial class, the people who function as bureaucrats and administrators and office workers for the most part. You're going to have a loss of differentiation in job function because everybody is just going to be performing the woke dance. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around what the consequences for society as a whole are going to be at that stage.
No, yeah, I've thought about this. I mean, I especially think about this because it's going to influence what I do in the future in regards to the academy. And I do want to ask you this. I'm going to see if I can word this in a way that sort of makes sense. So how would you go about, would you agree that when we are teaching controversial things, and so I'm not talking about like, creationism versus evolution. I'm talking about something much more controversial, something that maybe 50% of the population disagrees with versus 50% of the population agrees with. Let's say the topic of abortion. Do you think in that instance, because it is so controversial in the real world, in academia, not only do you just sort of describe the facts as they are, but you also inform the student of the debates on the pros or versus the cons? Or do you think in academia there should be no moral apparatus at work at all? It's just teach the facts as it actually is.
Well, I think that people should value the pursuit of truth, and people should value these criteria or criteria very much like them. I think people have a moral obligation not to be stupid. And when I'm talking about stupidity here, I don't mean like people who are born with Down syndrome or something. I mean people who make decisions that prevent them from being able to appraise the world in a sensible fashion. I definitely would endorse that kind of ethic as governing, intellectual life. Presenting the facts, people should be presented with. They should faithfully be presented with all plausible interpretations of the facts, let's say. So in sociology, for example, when they present potential counter arguments to their beliefs, they shouldn't they shouldn't be doing what they typically do, which is to present an unrecognizable distortion of their opposition. They should be making a serious effort to try to take the opposing point of view into consideration. When people take issue with critical race theory, for example, and its view about the primacy of demography, and people argue against that, your first instinct should not be to condescendingly inform them that it's okay to see color. This is a bumper sticker. This isn't a serious characterization of their opposition. it's just a way for them to unload their canned speech about how color blindness is actually racism in disguise and blah, 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 without actually addressing the types of arguments that are being presented. I think, yeah, I think, well, I said what I think.
No, yeah, no, I 100% agree. Anyway, so I think this is a sort of good way to sort of close it off. I do want to ask you this one last thing. You mentioned this sort of at the beginning of the podcast. What are some things in your current views on naturalism that you're not that confident about? There's some things that you said that you're still sort of working out, sort of fine-tuning the kinks.
Regarding naturalism, I think at this stage I'm fairly confident in everything that I've stated. In terms of other things, though, I'm still kind of working out an explanation for how the Academy reached its current state. The set of incentives that led it here and the type of scholarship that's involved. I'm putting together the pieces of this enormous, complex puzzle, and a lot of it is mysterious to me. I know that a large part of what's going on is not being motivated by the earnest desire to understand how the world works, and that a lot of it is being motivated by something else. But how exactly the pieces fit together, it's difficult. Maybe there is no correct answer. Maybe what's happening in our time is just the intersection of a certain set of circumstances beyond anybody's understanding or control, and that the current historical moment is not the logical endpoint of some process that's been taking place, but is just chaos.
Mm-hmm. Make sure you have the optimal flexibility in your interpretations of people's motives. Yeah. So make sure that if someone says that they're not racist, that you don't take that as evidence that they actually are racist. Yeah. But yeah, anyways,
good advice.
Good for Robin DiAngelo for sure. So Casey, I really appreciate you returning and coming back and sort of helping me understand what is naturalism and how to properly approach the philosophy of science, or at the very least another perspective on how to approach the philosophy of science, and always trying to get closer and closer to understanding my own viewpoints. So thank you so much for your presence, of course, for even deciding to come back on, and as also for helping me understand what these things are.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a good chat.
Yeah, and again, everyone go ahead and check out his YouTube channel. Has some great videos on there, some very long videos on there. But I really do think it's even if you're not a naturalist, even if you don't agree with it, I think the way in which Casey articulates it is done in a way that if it doesn't make you think, then I'm more concerned about whether or not you actually paid attention than whether or not you disagree with it. But anyways, once more, thank you so much, Casey, and
thank you.
Hope to see you again in the future.
All right.
Thank you to everyone who support us either through YouTube membership or Patreon. It really means a lot. Your time is precious, and we really appreciate you spending some of it on us. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope to see you next time.